Welcome, everyone. I'm the founder of Quidroom, the social platform for where accredited investors and investment professionals globally find each other. Before we kickstart, for all the investors who are listening in to the session and the podcast, if any of your questions are unanswered or to attend future investor meetups, you can join hundreds of other investors in my personal community in Quidroom. The invitation link is going to be posted here. Today, we have Liron Azrielant, an active investor in Israel tech startups. Liron also manages a young venture capital forum in Israel, a professional organization that connects Israel-focused professional startup investors together. Hi, Liron. How are you doing?
Hi, Pravin. Great to be here.
Good to have you on board. Now, I'm just going to start with an obvious one because in our podcast, we love investor origin stories. Usually whenever we meet with investors, they must have done quite a bit of things in their life. But what we really like to hear about is a turning point in your life that made you believe that, hey, you know what, Israel tech startups, I should be supporting them. I should be investing into them right now. So when did Israel startups and investing into them became your true north? And why?
Wow. I think to me, this was a bit of the other way around because you know how like fish don't see the water. I was born and bred in Israel. I was fully aware of the ecosystem. It looked very normal to me that instead of dreaming on becoming a movie star, people dream on starting a startup. It was, you know, it's in the culture, it's in the school program. It's just something that's really celebrated here in Israel. And then, so when I was 23 years old, I left Israel for 6 years to pursue my master's degree. So I did the master's in computer science and business administration. So it was a bit about coming out of this environment and looking at it from the outside and seeing how this ethos of startup nation doesn't necessarily exist everywhere. And, you know, honestly, there's a little bit of it in New York. There's a lot of it. It's almost like the epicenter in San Francisco. But Israel is just a brilliant place to start companies, and especially in deep tech. So I think it was more about leaving the ecosystem and seeing other places where I saw it.
That's pretty interesting. So you mentioned that from the time that you're in school, a startup ecosystem is being built in schools there in Israel. Is that right?
Well, I guess what I mean is that if you approach the average person on the street and ask him about, you know, do you know any founders, successful founders of startups, or what does it mean to start your own company? And even if you ask, you know, ask the random cab driver, he would have some sort of an idea and some sort of draw to it. It's in the culture. I feel like even when you're choosing what to major in high school, it's something that's in your consciousness. When you choose computer science, you know that it's to start a software startup, or it's just something that's around us, around the culture in Israel, and from a very early age. They're actually next week I'm judging at an entrepreneurship program for youth, for people who are 14, 15, 16, and they need to build a business pitch for a startup that they're thinking of launching. So yeah, I feel like at the very least the awareness, and in some places the training too, comes very early in Israel.
Well, that is pretty interesting. That is definitely interesting. Very very different. Now I want to, before we go and do a bit more of a deep dive of the Israeli startup ecosystem, because today's subject we are going to be focusing on deep tech investing, right? Let's kick off with the basic question for investors who, especially right now, do not have any exposure into deep tech. Why would you say now is the right time to consider investing into deep tech startups?
Well, I guess I want to divide my answer into two, because there's deep tech in general, and then there's deep tech coming out of Israel, and that I might be preempting your next question here.
Yeah.
So in terms of deep tech in general, so if you look at there are definitely a lot of really great startups that wouldn't consider deep tech, social networks, consumer goods, and they're really strong. There's a lot of them. But when you look at deep tech startups, those companies tend to have a very, very strong moat that oftentimes can't be bought. So if you look at a company that reached, say, 1 million users, they're a corporate that's competing with them is only, say, a few tens of $millions away in marketing dollars from beating them. It is an advantage, but it's also an advantage that's easy to take away. When a company is founded around several engineers' excitement about researching and creating this new technology, or developing something that's better than everything that's existed, corporates could theoretically try and compete with it, but historically it hasn't worked as well. Innovation is hard to obtain, and really, really strong founders, and especially in Israel, tend to thrive in small companies and build faster and better in those small companies. And this is why, especially if you look at cybersecurity, a lot of the new innovations that large corporations have brought into the market were created inorganically. And by that, I mean by buying other startups. And corporates are really happy to overpay when acquiring a startup if it brings them a technology that is better than what they could develop in-house.
Interesting. So that brings me, because you already mentioned about the strong moat. Now, for investors to better understand this, investors that are actively investing into tech and have not specifically drilled down into deep tech would usually want to compare and see exactly what are the differentiators on when I'm looking to invest into the deep tech focused software startup specifically. How can I compare that with the usual SaaS focused startup investments that I'm doing right now? Is the process similar, or is there going to be some kind of difference around it?
So it's a good question. And I think before I answer it, I want to clarify that I only invest in the earliest stages. And in that stage, it is very different, because what we're trying to see, what we're actually assessing, is not how good the company is now or how good the product is, because oftentimes there's no product. What we are assessing is the strength and the fit of the founders to this specific company, to this specific technology. And when you look at your run-of-the-mill SaaS startup, it's really important for founders to have several qualities. A lot of them has to do with scale, with understanding of marketing, knowing how to build channels. A lot of it has to do with the distribution. When you're looking at deep tech software companies, you need to assess the founder's ability not only to build something new themselves, but to be able to draw in the right talent and the people around them to create this top tier team. And a lot of startups, the success of a lot of startups was actually determined not by how strong the founders were, but how strong the team that the founders were able to create was. So when you're looking at how we diligence these companies, a lot of it has to do with whether that person is a leader in their field but also whether they're a known leader and whether they have the reputation, because strong engineers are drawn to strong engineers. And this is something that really makes or break a company.
That's great. Now that means I would have to definitely deep dive a little bit more on that, right? So if it is a SaaS company can potentially succeed even if, let's say, the person who is on the helm is not a software engineer, but is good at distribution. There is a possibility, but for deep tech, you need to be at least a bit of a subject matter expert. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. As a general rule, I'll say it this way. Personally, at least, I have yet to see a deep tech startup succeeding without having at least one, typically two founders coming from deeply within that domain. And yeah, this has to do with ability to hire, reputation, and even when corporations are looking at cybersecurity is a great example for this. When corporations are looking on whether to buy a certain product that has to do with cybersecurity, the rapport of the person making the initial sale, which at the beginning is the founder, is just so important, sometimes even more important than how well the product is built, the UI, the UX, the marketing. Because if you trust a certain individual to understand that specific domain better than others, then you would also trust the product a lot more.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for that. Now let's just look into that a little more from the lens of startups that are coming out of Israel, right? So the deep tech software startups in Israel, last time you had mentioned that they definitely have an advantage. Now, the question is how so?
Yeah, great question, because there are just so many answers to it. I want to start by actually addressing the disadvantages of startups coming out of Israel. And this is that us as Israeli, we're developing a product that its goal is to be used by people living 500 miles away. Typically, Israel is developing technology for the US. That is the biggest market. There are a lot of cultural similarities with it, but it's a market that's far away. And so in the deep tech domain, this tends to be also an enterprise sale. And when you're making a consumer sale, understanding and being fully in tune with the consumers is just number one. With enterprise sales, this is a gap that could easily be bridged with traveling to the US, spending a few months there, because you make all sales, at least the initial sales, very manual. And this is why it fits better. And potentially Israel's biggest disadvantage, which is the distance, is overcome. Now to the other advantages, which I think are just very, very, very strong, give Israel a huge edge. First and foremost, the Israeli army. So when I was 17, I was developing technologies more cutting edge than I did in any later part of my professional career. The army has, so first of all, there's mandatory service. The army is the one employer that basically gets everybody. They are really, really advanced in identifying top engineers early on and training them very well. And if you think of what the army is, so of course there's classic non-intelligence force army, and that's a big part of it. But within intelligence force and the other technological units, there's essentially the units are essentially developing tools to obtain information, tools to gain visibility where you don't have it. And this is why, first and foremost, Israel is just really strong in cybersecurity. There's the training. You get training even before you're old enough to go to college. You get this training. And also think about it. when you go to college, you learn about commercial technologies, typically a few years after those technologies reached commercial companies. When you go to the army, you learn about nascent technologies, typically a few years before those technologies are, call it, downgraded to corporate. A lot of the new
and everyone gets to learn about it. Everyone.
Sorry?
And everyone gets to learn about the nascent technology on the
everybody on the technological units. So, the mandatory army service, everybody goes to the army. Not everybody goes to the technology units, but I think even the foot soldiers are exposed to it in some minimal way, simply by learning what's possible, learning about how the development process goes. But I'm actually focusing more on the graduates of the technological units, and there are enough of those to impact the entire country, because you take, I have no idea of the percentage, but it's significant. You take some percentage of the population and you give them this insane training, and that impact all of Israel's access to top talent. So if you're a technologist, you have all this firsthand knowledge. If you're a CEO of a company, you have access to all these technologies. So it's just it's just an injection of an amazingly talented workforce that has very unique training. But it's not just the specific training. It's also the approach. It's you're 17, you're given a task of building a tool that would actually be used to obtain information. This is responsibility in your hand that typically people don't get before their early 30s or late 20s. To build something that's operational, that's huge. So you're sort of released into this world with an approach that what you do matters, and what you do moves the needle for entire country. So how easy it is to believe that you can move the needle for a startup, for a company.
So you were talking about nascent technology. That actually brings me, that's pretty interesting. So I'm not sure exactly to what extent you would be able to answer this, but it will be good for me to know, for a lot of people to know, especially foreign investors, right? I mean, foreign investors, when they look into Israeli startups, obviously cyber security is right out there. So people can easily see that there are opportunities, and they have already seen the companies that are coming out from Israel around that to see the opportunities there, right? Now, in addition to that, what are the most radical / nascent areas of deep tech that is coming up, and that is big, and that you guys are actively looking into to invest into? But currently for foreign investors, it is being undervalued and they do not know much about it.
Yeah, so great question. Unfortunately, I'm only going to be able to answer it in a very broad way and not a very specific way. But yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily call it fields as much as technologies and techniques, because what you learn is what you have, and the field is how you apply it, because you could apply. So, cybersecurity is obvious, right? It's the training, but that's also the application. But think of other areas such as image processing. So within the realm of obtaining information, obviously there's a lot of image processing, and that could be applied into medicine, and it could be applied into ad tech, and it could be applied into marketing. There's just a lot of applications to it. So our question are, when we look at where Israel is strong and what we're looking for, isn't necessarily what fields are interesting, more what capabilities do you have? And then the next question is, where could that be applied? So cybersecurity, just very plainly getting into networks, obtaining stuff from networks, and then the corollary of it, of stopping people from getting into your network or getting into your endpoint. I think that's a known secret in Israel. The rest of it is, think about it, you have all this petabytes of data, and it could be sound data, it could be bits and bytes, it could be images. Now it's about finding your arms and legs in this pile of information. And this is where a lot of the non-obvious technologies come to play. So Israel is especially strong in everything, natural language processing and analysis, machine learning, deep learning, image processing, storage, fast getting information into storage, out of storage. I'm trying to think what else. And these are technologies that are used to manage this data. So big data processing, this is just really big in Israel, and you take from here into all of its application. So we see quite a few digital health startups, quite a few fintech startups, quite a few enterprise tools. There's actually a lot of DevOps tools, because then the second hand of it is you build the software, then you need DevOps for it. And I think those are strong areas in Israel. And this is also where we invest in.
No, that's interesting. So now we spoke about quite a bit of areas, and I could see exactly how how it makes sense for a lot of these applications to be important in US and the commercial element around it, right? So that actually brings me to go a little bit down on the political side of things, because again, Joe Biden is visiting Israel right now, right? So and from what I get in terms of indications that we have heard, of course, there is a chance to attract more Israeli technology while dissuading the sectors and the ties with China, right? So that means there's definitely rivalry being played in here, obviously, and the question then is, what would be the direct impact on this for investors in the tech sector in Israel?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I feel like this is something that, I guess to some extent, Israelis and investors in Israel, it's a reality that in one way, shape, or form has impacted us throughout. And just as a bit of a personal story, so we did the initial closing for our fund in May of 2021, so just over a year ago. The day before the initial closing, we had another round of warfare with the Gaza Strip, to the point where the alarms were going up in Tel Aviv, which is something that happens, but honestly, it's quite rare in Israel. There's, we're considered an area of conflict, but it hardly ever hits the street. You hardly ever feel it. And we were impacted by it to the point that the alarm was going on, and we had to go to the shelter, which for us felt out of this world. It happens in my life in Tel Aviv. It happened twice, and all we're thinking of isn't, oh, I hope the rocket isn't going to fall on my house. We're thinking, I hope our investors won't be fazed by what's going on there. And we go to work the next morning, just really afraid, preparing ourselves for at least one investor changing their minds, and nothing. They behave business as usual. And later on we asked them this, and it's like, yeah, Israel knows how to handle it. We were completely unfazed. We didn't even think about it. So I feel like it's mostly, I feel like in some ways that's the baseline, but also what you mentioned and Biden's visit, and there's also talks about normalization of the relationship with Saudi. So yeah, I guess it's two things. I guess the ecosystem and the people of Israel are used to operating under some called minimal level of uncertainty on the one hand, but then this level of uncertainty is slowly being reduced and is slowly in our, all the factors that were hampering our business are getting more and more rare. So I feel like investing in Israel is always great, but it's potentially going to be even better with some hurdles that are going to be lifted in the upcoming years.
Thanks for that. Now, I want to go into a very direct question, mainly about where you are right now, because I know that, and thanks for confirming. So you have been receiving capital, of course, for your fund. So if foreign investors want to look into investing into Israel and they want to actually have a word with you, or they want to actually get to know about exactly the whole ecosystem, how would you be able to help these investors?
Sure. First of all, for having lived here most of my life and investing here for about 7 years, I have a plethora of knowledge. I can definitely help them with introductions. Statistically, if you think of a company in Israel, I probably either know the company or know someone that does. So I'm happy to make myself available for questions and for everything. Then the second element is that, well, we're currently not accepting funds. There are a lot of great places, and potentially, if you're an investor thinking of your first step in Israel, investing in a fund of funds is potentially a really great place to start. And we're happy to connect you to some of our LPs that have a position in our fund, and to very strong professionals that we know that also have a strong thesis on Israel and chose to invest in us, as well as some other amazing funds.
Of course, just adding a disclaimer, it's not an advice, but it's just a suggestion.
Of course.
Yeah, but it's also very good to know, Liron, that you are completely subscribed for your fund. Definitely, that is a testament that your investors like working with you, and they have been actually putting their faith with you. So that is actually great, and it was really good to have you on board. And this was very enlightening to give an idea of exactly what's happening in Israel, especially in the deep tech sector. And I'm sure there will be certain investors who will have questions around that. Now, everyone who would want to know anything about Israel, as Liron mentioned, please feel free to just ping her, and I'm sure she will be more than happy to help. You were great to host, and that's all from me for today. Let's make investments better, one step at a time. For today, let's say goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Liron. Bye.